Okay, so now we're getting to a different idea for how to justify the state, and that is to appeal to the positive consequences of having a state around. And that argument can be made by appeal to utilitarianism. Now, what is utilitarianism? Many of you will have heard this in your X-Fill lectures if you have done that. If you haven't done X-Fill, here's a short introduction. The proponents of classical utilitarianism include Bentham, Mill, and Sidgwick. Their aim was to systematize morality under a single principle. That's the principle of utility. The idea here is that there's only one thing that is intrinsically or in itself valuable, and that is happiness. But they define happiness as a surplus of pleasure over pain. So if you have more pleasure than pain, you weigh pain with pleasure, then you're happy, and you're less happy if you have more pain than pleasure. So you see, someone's not happy. And an action is then morally right if it produces the greatest overall balance of happiness. And this is important. It's greatest overall balance of happiness. So it's what makes overall everyone most happy. So we're going back to the consequence of that. Now, according to this classical utilitarianism, pleasure is intrinsically valuable. So Mill puts it as this: the utilitarian doctrine is that happiness is desirable and the only thing desirable as an end, all other things being desirable as means to that end. So the basic idea is, for every candidate thing that may be desired, ask why is that desirable? The only thing that's desirable for its own sake is happiness, and that's what has intrinsic value. That's also an idea you might have heard in X-Fill. Contrast that with money. In the case of money, we don't want money in itself. We want money to buy us happiness. Whether it actually delivers us is another question. So money has extrinsic value. So, but here it is, what has intrinsic value is happiness. And that's what we should maximize. Now, there's a question about whether all kinds of happiness or pleasure count the same. And the utilitarians are not in agreement on this question. So Mill, for example, thought that the sort of higher pleasures count for more. So better be a Socrates satisfied than a dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. He thought that the kind of higher pleasures that Socrates or a philosopher or human generally can enjoy are worth much more than those pleasures that can be enjoyed by simple animals. Bentham, on the other hand, another of the utilitarian philosophers, he thought that it's only about the quantity of pleasure. So poetry or pushpin was a game they played in his time, where I think you just like press against each other, and the question is who would press another. Whatever you enjoy, he thought it doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is how much happiness is generated. Okay, so there is disagreement about whether you can be utilitarian and think that some pleasures count for more than others, or you can be utilitarian and think that all pleasures count the same. Okay, so the idea then, sorry, I should stay here. The idea then is that we're going to justify the state by saying that living in a state together, that's what's going to generate overall the highest amount of happiness. Now, that can appeal to this idea of the Hobbesian state of nature. In the state of nature, you might think, without a state, we would all kill each other. So we're all much better off we are overall much better off with the state in place. And so the overall amount of happiness, given that there is a state, is a lot higher than the amount of happiness that would have existed if if we had no state. And arguably, this is correct. To think about whether it's correct, you might think, well, in cases we have failed states, when countries' legal systems break down, then we see the kind of chaos. And if that's right, that this is the result, then we think the overall amount of happiness is much higher if we all agree to having a state. And this is, of course, a kind of consideration that you also find these days, for example, when talking about the coronavirus restrictions. Why do we have an obligation to follow the restrictions that are set in place in regarding when we can leave the house, whether we can drink beer with our friends and so on? Because it will increase the overall amount of happiness. Fewer people will suffer when everyone does that. So that would be utilitarian justification for our obligations to follow those rules. Now, unfortunately, there's some fairly strong criticisms of utilitarianism. And these come in a number of different ways. The problem generally is that utilitarianism just counts the overall amount of happiness, and it doesn't, in a sense, look at how the happiness is generated. Okay, so here's one problem. Suppose that you're a sheriff in a small town in which a particularly ghastly murder has occurred. Knowing the nature of the people, you know that if no one is punished for the deed, then riots will occur, which can be reliably predicted to take the lives of a dozen innocent people. So there will be riots if no one is punished. Since the townspeople believe Mr. X to be the guilty party, so they believe that X did it, you know that the riots can be prevented if you just execute that person. But you know, because say you have done the investigation, that X is actually innocent. You know it was someone else. Maybe you don't know who it was, or maybe you know who it was, but you can't find the person. Now question, should you make it the case that Mr. X is killed in order to save the lives of these 12 people that would be killed by the riots? So you sacrifice one person in order to save the lives of 12. According to utilitarianism, it seems pretty obvious. More happiness is generated if you kill Mr. X, and so you should do it. But many people think that would be unfair. Mr. X had nothing to do with this crime, and so it'd be absolutely unjust, unfair to sacrifice Mr. X. So that's a very poor, powerful problem with utilitarianism. Another one is that it seems to allow for really horrible acts. Suppose you're a surgeon and have 5 patients that are dying of organ failure. But you also have 1 healthy patient whose organs can save the 5. So you just take the heart for 1 patient, you take the lungs for another person, take the kidney for another person. So should you rip that person apart and distribute the organs to others? According to utilitarianism, it's about 5 lives versus 1 life. It seems like you should do it. It seems though that is horrible. That doesn't seem morally right at all. More odd implications. Suppose there are 2 people in a burning house, your mother and an eminent scientist. You love your mother, but while you and your family would miss her badly, her death would not mean much to reduce the total amount of happiness in the world at large. The scientist, however, is on the verge of discovering a cure for cancer, and his death will seriously adversely affect the world's happiness quotient. So here's, since the utilitarianism implies you should not save your mother, you should certainly save that surgeon. So it requires us to save always those people who can generate somehow the most amount of happiness. So utilitarianism has some pretty bad consequences. Now, you might defend utilitarianism in 3 different ways, and I'll let you think about that. You can try to contest the consequence. You might so argue that, in fact, when you do the calculation right, then utilitarianism doesn't have those horrible consequences. They calculate the amount of happiness in the right way. Another way to think is that we shouldn't just calculate happiness generally. We should rather act according to certain. Utilitarianism requires us to act according to specific rules, which in general, if you follow them, will lead to an overall amount of happiness. So this would say we shouldn't just at each time, for example, calculate whether following the law now is increasing the amount of happiness. Rather, we should generally think about, is it a good rule to have that we should follow the law, and will that generally lead to overall amount of happiness? So that's another way to so go from act utilitarianism. We evaluate each act to a rule utilitarianism. Another way of responding is to reject common sense and says, well, all these 3 consequences, they are just this is just what people feel that's unfair, but in fact it's common sense is just wrong. Our moral feelings are mistaken. We should rather follow what utilitarianism says. Now, for more, you can of course remember what you did in Exfil, or maybe you can look forward to Exfil, or if you haven't done it, where you will learn a lot more about utilitarianism. For now, just to point out that if you want to use utilitarianist thinking to justify why people have an obligation to follow the law, so you think it will increase the overall amount of happiness, then you have to make sure that you defend utilitarianism against those objections. Okay, so now we have looked at we've looked at 2 different ways of justifying the authority of the state. One is that people have consented. Seen that is somewhat problematic because people have not in fact consented. Then we've looked at the idea that increases the overall amount of happiness, utilitarian thinking. We have seen that utilitarian thinking is also problematic. So that now, and I'm going to only put that in the written part of the lecture, leaves the question of whether the state can be justified at all. So maybe we should be anarchists who think that the state cannot be justified, or maybe there's another consideration, as I mentioned at the beginning, maybe you can appeal to that principle of fairness. And so you can read about that in the written part of the lecture. Okay, thanks a lot. And with that,